So just to recap, thanks so much, Mariana, for your input as we start with this first question. You shared an executive as someone who's making decisions for the good of the organization. And I guess a follow-up question, would love to get your perspective, is why is that person the one being asked to make decisions versus someone else?
I guess it's the fact that all the ideas from the teams that are part of that, the executive team, I guess it's because the experience they've had in different levels across, their careers and perspectives. I guess it makes them fit to, have the last call, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I'm curious about is in any organization, there may be lots of people with relevant experience, right? You may be one of those people with lots of relevant experience. How come some people get asked to do the thing or get elevated to an executive position while others do not, when you have a strong candidate pool, right? Like, what is it what's going on when they say, Mariana, we want you to lead this project versus someone else? How is that decision being made?
Based on competencies, previous experiences on other projects, success stories, probably. I guess those are the top things that would come to my mind when choosing someone at this level.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Now, I'm going to add an additional layer on top of what you just said, which I agree with 100%. It is the perception of all those things, right? There's things that happen, right? There's experience we have. No one can take that away from us. There's projects that we've completed, metrics, awards, education, degrees, things that we can point to, right? So those are sort of facts, right? They happen. There's an additional layer before the decision is made, I would argue, which is the perception of those. Like, does it matter to me? So one person may hear, oh, you went to Harvard, and they may be like, big deal. I went to Princeton, I went to Yale, right? And another person may be like, oh my gosh, this person went to Harvard, they should be in charge. Or someone could say, I don't trust people who went to these elite institutions. They often don't work as hard. I would prefer someone from, a more standard college that isn't as elite and doesn't, that you'd really have to work hard to distinguish yourself to get where you are, compared to someone who maybe is coasting on, previous work that's been done before or reputation, right? So what Mariana pointed out is exactly right. And there's additional levels in terms of that perception, right? And at the root of it, when we talk about executive presence, it helps to understand executive and presence, right? There's two parts to the word. And executive comes from the root word exequi, which means to carry out, right? So fundamentally, at its most simplest, an executive is a person who gets stuff done, right? They are selected, as Mariana shared with us, to get things done. And there is a judgment that you are the person, Mariana, who should be getting these things done versus someone else who may have similar qualifications, similar experience. But there's something about Mariana, right? There's something about her. We're going to go with Mariana for the promotion, for the project, for the trip, whatever it is, right? So that's the first piece of executive presence. Now, what is presence, right? We understand a little bit better what executive is. And I'm going to ask, let's see, Lawanda, if you are here and can come off of mute. Would love to hear from you. When you hear the word presence, what does that mean to you in terms of executive presence? What's the presence piece? Hi, Lawanda. If you can come off of mute. If not, I can move on to Lindsay Campbell. What is presence to you, Lindsay, when you hear that in the context of executive presence?
So apologies in advance. I don't have much of a voice. I actually have COVID.
Oh no.
But I can answer your question.
Thank you.
So I guess when you say executive presence, I'm thinking about, I don't know, representation and accessibility. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but if I'm saying like, especially when we're talking about underrepresented groups, I'm thinking about um, who's being represented in the executive team, and um, are the underrepresented groups, do they have access to the executive team? I'm not sure if that's the answer you're looking for, but that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely what we're here to talk about. If I could ask a follow-up question, you know, how do you feel when you walk into a room and you meet people, and some of them are executives or not, and someone has tremendous executive presence, right? Like how does that feel? What is that experience like versus someone
I
maybe that you
see.
don't have confidence in?
Yeah. Um, so I guess um, sometimes that can be really intimidating, depending on what kind of presence that person has. I think that relates a bit to the accessibility part, right?
Mhm.
If you walk in and someone has really great presence and confidence, they really make you feel comfortable. They make you feel like part of the team and like you can contribute. But sometimes you walk into a room of executives and it's just like intimidation, right? It doesn't. They don't feel accessible and they don't feel approachable, and you don't feel in place in that room.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, last follow-up question, because I want to, I know, thank you for contributing despite the hoarseness. And thank you. This has been so helpful, Lindsay. Last question is, when you walk into the room and there's someone with amazing executive presence, like we're talking about, like it's George Clooney or, I don't know, someone that has like amazing executive presence, do they have to necessarily talk to you or say anything to you or do anything for you to feel that they have amazing executive presence? Does an action
No,
have to always occur?
no, it's always about perception, and it's definitely going to have some unconscious bias in it too. Who you perceive to be the confident one, the intelligent one, etc. Um, you know, that that's all part of the problem, right? In terms of representation. But you're right; it doesn't have to have an action. They don't have to. They don't have to speak to you. It's going to be how you perceive them.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Really appreciate your input. And what Lindsay has pointed out here is that presence is sort of that space that you occupy and how people perceive it, right? That's what's going on. A lot of times when you learn about executive presence from more traditional ways of thinking about it, it's like, how do you dress, right? You have to act and dress a certain way. You have to stand a certain way, right? You have to, communicate a certain way. Your voice should be deeper to sound like Elizabeth Holmes or someone with a lot of authority, right? Like those things are sort of maybe signifiers or shortcuts that people have identified that maybe some people with executive presence have. However, they don't actually generate the presence, right? Like the presence can be there regardless of having any action. It's executive presence, not executive doing. So what we're doing in just this first part of the presentation is making sure we're all on the same page, understanding what executive presence is and how it works. And then in the second part of the presentation, which is the fun part, is to really understand, well, what does that mean for underrepresented professionals? Because as Lindsay pointed out, there's a lens, there's an expectation that may be different. And as Joe pointed out with the Tom Brady analogy, which I love to talk about, is there may be certain expectations where people get an easier expectation of executive presence, where other people, through no skill, fault, or experience of their own, they are dinged and they don't get the same sort of perception at a default level, right? So that's what we're going to explore today. So it's an executive. It's someone who carries things out, right? And is given the job to do that. That's why you're called an executive. And then there's presence, right? Do you feel like the type of person who should be the one who's selected to be getting things done? Or do you just have a fancy title? And I think a lot of us have met people, unfortunately, in our careers who have the title, but don't have the executive presence. So today we're going to learn a little bit more about why that is and how to generate outsized executive presence, especially if you have been hearing that maybe one of the things that you should work on is executive presence, rightly or wrongly. When you get that feedback, it's helpful to understand what we're going to go over next. So, what is executive presence? So I came up with a definition as I was researching and writing my book, Unlock Your Executive Presence, Feel Like a Boss. Executive presence, all it is, right? It's not how you dress. It's not how you communicate. It's not your gravitas. It's the ability to inspire confidence that you can lead well in a given situation. So I'm going to say it again. This is sort of one of the keys here. Executive presence is the ability to inspire confidence that you can lead well in a given situation. So I'm going to get some input here from, let's see, Reggie. Reggie, if you can come off of mute. Would love to get your sort of reaction to the definition. Does that match with your experience of executive presence, either your own or maybe people you admire who have a lot of executive presence?
Yes, I would agree. And I think it does go to how someone can lead the room, how they appear on stage, can they roll out a strategy, their meeting presence. So I agree with the definition. And I think good leaders are people who not only can lead from the stage, but also in one-on-one conversations and connection points to where, hey, I get it. I see why he or she is in that position.
And let me ask you a question. How do you inspire confidence that you should be the leader, right? Like the people that you've seen who've been great leaders, like what is it about them that inspires confidence versus someone else who didn't get their job?
I think understanding the vision, and if I'm in sales, understanding the products, being knowledgeable about whatever the conversation is or whatever they're the executive of, and then I think it's easy to follow someone who's been there, done that, and they can give you clear step-by-step, direction, motivation to get to that next step in your career or when it be selling products.
So Reggie, that sounds, and I agree with everything you said, that sounds like a personal evaluation or judgment that you're making about that person, right? Like this is
Yes.
your view of that person. Might other people differ with your view?
Yes, of course. Yeah. And that could be for different reasons, whether it's, somebody may have different history with the person that we're viewing. Again, there's, like you said, people see things through different lenses, and it could be certain social or racial concerns or issues. But yeah, I think everybody can see leaders or executive presence in different ways.
And let me ask you a question. In different situations, do you think people can have more or less executive presence, or do you think it's like a consistent trait that, like, if you have executive presence, you have it in every single scenario?
No, I think it can vary from different situations, because if you're not confident
Mm-hmm.
in a you could be on stage leading your organization, but the next day be on the golf course, for example, and you haven't played golf ever, and be on the tee box with everybody looking at you. You wouldn't have executive presence in that moment, So I think it just depends on your surroundings and your situation.
Yeah, absolutely. What Reggie's pointing out is it's not only person specific, right? So Reggie may think something, and Karen may think something else, and then Josh may think something else, right? It'll differ depending on the person, and it also differs on the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
You may have less confidence, right, presenting
Mm-hmm.
in front of high school kids, which I did last week. Presented to one of the scariest audiences ever, like a room full of over 100 high school students that don't want to hear from an old fogey like myself, right? Versus maybe in the boardroom, you're much more comfortable. Or it could be the opposite. Maybe you're a teacher right? And kids don't scare you, but the thought of presenting to executives, even at like a nonprofit or, you know, some sort of local community center with adults, that terrifies you, right? So what we're starting to see here is executive presence is not like this singular trait that you're born with. It's not something that you put in your pocket and you carry around with you all the time. It is very dynamic, and it changes based on the situation, and it changes based on your confidence level. And before we go on, just want to share the definition one more time to drive the point home, right? It's the ability to inspire confidence that you can lead well in a given situation.
You got a couple of other comments in here. They are empathetic, or these are people that know how to connect. And then we have one here that says they present as human. So those are some other comments from some of the other people that are here about this topic of executive presence.
So Ernisha and Mariana, thanks for those comments. And Joe, thanks for calling that out, because it can be difficult to manage everything at once. So I do appreciate the assist. What I would say is all these comments about what creates executive presence are 100% correct for you, right? Because that's your thing, right? Let me just paint a picture of someone that is fictional, right? Let's just call them Voldemort, right? Voldemort, he's not down with empathy. Voldemort, he's more like, strike first, strike hard, no mercy, right? To him, he wants people who are ruthless, and that shows executive presence. He wants people who don't feel pain and can't feel other people's pain, because those are the people he wants to lead his army of dark wizards or whatever. We're huge Harry Potter fans, if you hadn't noticed. So it really depends on your individual view of the person. So for that person to have executive presence with you, they have to inspire that confidence with you. So now you can see how executive presence is very tricky, right? You can't just plug in an algorithm and a formula, walk into any situation with high school kids, elementary school kids, CEOs, clients, sales presentation. It doesn't work that way, right? It's much more context specific. It's much more nuanced. It differs with the people who report to you. It differs with the people you report to. It can be totally different each time. So I think, that's one really important thing to take away from this, that nuance helps. Damien has a comment here. They seem to be aware of the bigger or long picture, intervene in ways to, absolutely, Damien, absolutely correct. And I think what you're seeing from these comments is there are certain things that are more likely to be perceived as having executive presence in a certain community or maybe just in the world at this time, right? Executive presence in 2022, is that the year we're in now, may be very different than executive presence in 3020 or 1920 or 1820. And that's okay, right? Because that's how it works. It's the ability to inspire confidence. That's happening now, right? Not in a single point in time that stays forever. That you versus the other person can lead well in a given situation. And it's situation specific, right? So then what we get to is what I like to call the 6 degrees of executive presence, right? You might be thinking, Joe, it's all fine and good to say that here's the definition. How does it work, right? How do you actually get there? So I've identified 6 degrees of executive presence. We'll just go over them at a high level. We're not going to deep dive into them so much, but just to give you a sense of how they work. And these are not the only things that can inspire executive presence, but they kind of neatly almost spell out presence, P-R-E-S-E-C. So they're a little bit easy to remember. And they're kind of like, I don't want to say universal, but they're kind of like commonly agreed upon things that would inspire executive presence. So let me see if I can, let's see, who can we ask here? Let's ask Mariana. Mariana, are you able to come off of mute and join us? If so, hey, Mariana, how are you?
Hello.
Okay, so give me a situation where you think someone would need to have executive presence. You don't have to provide too much details, but like a working situation or a community situation, like when would a person need to have executive presence? Give us a scenario, any scenario.
Like a regular employee or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's say somebody that feels not very represented or respected by their team, and then probably a lot of things are being not respected in the policies. Let's say in a diversity, equity, inclusion policy, probably some things are not being accomplished, and if an executive sends a message to all the organization talking about the importance of non-discrimination, of following up with the policies, it doesn't have to aim the speech to that person or to that situation that's going on. Everyone would understand, like just by that that public message that the executive is giving. I'm sorry, the language barrier kind of like it's playing me a hard time here, but yeah, like it's I would put it that way because I've seen it so many times.
Yeah,
that it has happened before.
So what I'm hearing from you, and let me know if I'm getting this right or wrong, you're saying that sometimes people, when they're communicating their commitment towards some cause, they need executive presence, but they may or may not have that.
Yes, like and I'm just gonna say one of the situations that I've seen and I've witnessed it before is that people have been discriminated by, let's say, mothers that just come back from maternity leave, right?
Okay.
They come back and there's all these comments and jokes about her being on vacation, like quotations, right? On vacation and so and so. So if an executive has this, like hears that this is going on, and in a public forum, in a town hall or whatever big event that goes on in the company, this executive takes the lead on mentioning the importance of respecting people, respecting diversity, respecting everyone in the organization. And so I consider that executive presence. It doesn't have to aim to that situation particularly, respecting like women that come back from maternity, but it really sends a message and you feel connected. You as a mother, let's say, I'm not a mother, but this person feels connected and motivated that, from the very top, these topics are taken care of.
Mariana, I love that example. I love that example you've shared. And to me, what that shows out of the 6 degrees executive presence is that executive is showing their executive presence, and you're feeling it, right, Mariana, because they're engaged, right? They see something going wrong, right? And it's very easy for them. They're an executive. They're flying here and there. They have meetings, right? It would be understandable to some if they didn't take up that cause maybe immediately or in the moment. But how much executive presence does that show to someone who cares about these things, like yourself, like me, I believe, like most of the people on this call, that they engage in that, they see that, and they say, look, either in the meeting right away, in a memo that goes out afterwards, in trainings and communications, they engage with that issue. They have their finger on the pulse of what's important, and they react and they respond to that. Now let's take a different situation, right? Equally brilliant executive, right? Hits the same numbers, same pedigree, same experience, looks the same. Like, let's say it's their twin brother or sister, right? But they just can't be bothered, right? Or well, actually, let me be a little bit kinder. They are bothered, but they don't do anything about it. They don't engage, right? They say, oh, this is a compliance HR problem. I'll send them a note, right? They don't engage with the issue. They don't call the person and say, look, I heard what happened. This is not right. You know, we're going to take care of this, right? You should not be treated this way. This doesn't show the values of our organization, right? How much different is the executive presence between those two individuals, Mariana, for you?
Well, I guess the reach of the impact, because if you say it publicly, you also send a message to those who decide not to follow the policies or the processes. And if you just go to this person directly, you might or might not do anything about it. I mean, you're caring at the very moment, but how many times it has happened that, you know, the executive approaches you and says, hey, we're going to take care of this, or this is just not tolerated here. We'll take care of it. And then a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year goes by, and then you still hear those comments, probably not to you, but to some other people. And the message, I guess, just doesn't accomplish the goal, which is just let the other people know that they're not allowed. Like it's a serious offense to communicate that way or to talk to colleagues like that or whatever. I guess, you know, it's the difference is the reach of the message, like who gets the message.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, what you're sharing now, Mariana, I really love this example. You're showing some other qualities of the 6 degrees of executive presence. You're showing someone who's proactive, right? They're actually going to do things that are going to make a difference. You're showing someone who's resolute, right? Who gets it right. Like, let's say you send that first message and behavior doesn't change. Do you say, oh, I did what I could, I'm done, I'm on to the next thing? Or are you resolute and say, look, I don't think this is right. It hurts our organization. It hurts the culture. It hurts our values. It hurts our productivity. I'm going to keep fixing this until it gets fixed. So what the 6 degrees of executive presence are meant to show is that it's your state of being with which you approach a situation, right? Remember we talked about presence before? It's not about doing, it's about your presence. When something happens and you are proactive, when something happens and you are engaged, often you do something, but the point is not the thing that you did. The point is that the state of being that you brought to the situation, which then activated the thing that you do. And what people feel is your state of being, not the action. So let's see, Damien, if you could come off of mute. Let me ask you a question. Has anyone ever apologized to you, but they didn't really mean it? Damien, are you there? Can you come off of mute? Okay, let me ask Ernisha. Hi, Ernisha, are you there? Can you come off of mute if you're able to? Hi, Ernisha.
Hello.
Same question. Has anyone ever apologized to you, but they didn't really mean it?
I can't really answer that question because I don't know. I can't really say if people mean their apology or not. I know people have apologized and it's felt like they haven't meant it.
Fair enough. You can't read their mind, right? I think what I'm trying to point out to here is that the words themselves don't carry the entire value, right?
Yes. Agree.
It's their heart. It's what's in their heart, right? Like they can say, Ernisha, I think you're doing a great job, or they could say, I think you're doing a great job, right? Yeah. Sarcasm, right? Backhanded compliments, right? It's the words. Oh, thanks, Damien. You're working on your audio settings. I appreciate that. I'll try to get back to you. What Ernisha's pointing out is that it's not just the words, right? It's the intention behind the words that makes a difference. And it's similar for executive presence, right? Do you have that underlying sort of energy and presence that's going to inspire confidence? And I want to bring it back to the definition just for a moment. the reason why this is important, right? Being proactive is important, being resolute. These are all good sort of states of being. But the reason why it's important with respect to executive presence is because it's going to inspire confidence that you should be leading. So, Ernisha, are there some situations where it's sort of good to be proactive versus other situations where maybe you want to be a little bit more still? Does that ever happen? Or is it always like you should always be proactive or you should always be cautious? What do you think?
I think, speaking just from my own perspective in this highly matrixed organization that I'm in, there, yes, you do have to be proactive, but then there's also times to exercise discretion and restraint. And it really depends upon the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And who are the key players you're trying to activate around a particular issue or event. So I'll give you an example, trying to equitably address, all of the recent events with the colleagues that we are responsible for supporting. And so there are ways to activate others in the organization to address those things. Very proactive, showing allyship and forward thinking and action. And those are situations where you have to exercise restraint.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can't necessarily be proactive and forceful and say, yep, the CEO.
Yeah. Apologies, your audio's cutting in and out, but I think I understand your example, which I really love, which is that there are different situations where you want to be more proactive and it's sort of welcome and you'll be seen as a leader. And there's others where maybe you're being proactive, not in the right moment, and that won't be perceived as being leadership material. It'd be better to be still, to listen, right? To understand more fully before you act. So that's a fantastic example, especially in the context of allyship, which is so important because these things don't get fixed alone. They only improve through the active participation of everyone in the organization, not just the groups involved, right? But like everyone in the organization pulling together to make the organization a better place.
Joe, while you were speaking, Renee also added to the chat that tone matters, tone and intent. And I just added my own comment as well. I couldn't agree more because tone and intent show up even when we try to hide tone and intent, right? You either are aligned, your voice, your tone, everything is aligned, or it's not. And if it's not, it comes across as insincere.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Joe. Renee, would love for you to come off mute if you can and share maybe a little bit more in detail, your thoughts on tone and intent and why that matters. And I certainly don't want to play poker with you anytime soon because I'm really bad.
Yeah. Is my mic on? Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah, you sound good.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Joseph. Yes, I agree that, sarcasm and stuff can definitely come off as ill intent. But I'm also wondering, could tone be interpreted differently and used differently depending on your culture? Because I feel like the tone, in some cases, I agree that tone is a big thing and can definitely say if someone really is sincere about what they're saying. But I think different cultures use different tones and it can be someone's tone can be interpreted differently. So just kind of wondering about that as well.
Renee, I love that nuance that you're bringing to the conversation. So folks, if you have fabulous insights like Renee, please add them in the chat. Want to hear from them. So I'm gonna put this in the context of our discussion, Renee, right? Because we're talking about executive presence. The tone is like a super valid point, right? So let me ask you a question. Let's say you misunderstand the tone of the person, and therefore they're not going to have executive presence with you, right? Whose problem is that? Whose challenge is that? Is it their challenge because now they have no executive presence with you, or is it your challenge because you don't feel it? Who's getting hurt the most here?
It's a really good question, Joe, and I think in some ways it could be both, depending how you look at it, right? I think it's like you said, it's very nuanced, and I think this is the power of the work that we do as diversity champions and professionals, which is like kind of empathy building a little bit. You know, and kind of putting each other in other folks' shoes. And I think as the leader that is trying to be aware of their executive presence, being aware of your audience and the culture that you're in and delivering the message to. So maybe educating yourself on that culture and how they like to receive information and how they like to be told information. So I think that's the responsibility of the person who is delivering the information. So that would be the person who's, you know, being more cautious of their executive presence and how it's being received. But as the receiver, also maybe giving a little grace. And if it did trigger something or you weren't sure if it was sincere, maybe asking that follow-up question, whether, you know, maybe it is in that public forum, there's an appropriate way to maybe ask to clarify without putting them on the spot. Or if you feel like it needs a deeper conversation, that may in a public setting put them in a negative light, maybe you know set up a one-to-one or approach them privately.
Yeah, so agree 100%. It is both, right? Let's focus just for a moment, Renee, on your executive presence, right? Because we're here to talk about executive presence for underrepresented professionals, right? So if you're in a situation where your tone or intent is being received in a way that you did not intend, right? Because of the lens that they put over it, whatever that happens to be, right? I would say that that becomes a challenge for you because you're trying to communicate executive presence to them, right? And sometimes what happens is we don't even understand that that's what's going on. You're like, did this at my other company. I do this with my family and it works 100%. I don't understand why this person or these people aren't perceiving me the same way, right? And it may very well be that their interpretation of tone and intent, either culturally, and we could be talking about countries or ethnicities, we could even be talking about organizations, right? Some organizations are much more like aggressive and others are much more, you know, communal or collegial, right? So it doesn't even just have to be like a capital C, you know, culture. So if you think about executive presence and how we're defining it, right? You're not having executive presence, not because you're doing the wrong thing. It's because your thing that you're doing is not being received as executive presence by the people that you're trying to communicate with, right? So having that awareness, which you've brought out, is step number one, right? Like, wait a second. I'm not going to be, if I raise my voice, if I'm soft, if I stand, if I sit, it's not going to be perceived correctly. So that's point number one. Point number two, which we're going to get to a little bit later in the presentation, is, well, what am I supposed to do about that? Especially if my way of doing things and being is me being me, and I don't want to be you, right? I don't want to become Tom Brady to be successful. I want to be Renee. I want to be Joe. I want to be Joe Santana, right? I want to be Lindsay. I want to be Lisa, Reggie. I don't want to become someone else in order to be successful. Yeah. So thanks for adding that excellent element to that, Renee. We have some other comments.
I was going to add a few things here real quick, Joe.
Go for it, Joe.
One is the topic of neurodiversity came up. Lindsay brought that up, which is really important. And I think you're going in that direction. One of the things that I also noted here, just as I'm listening to everyone and from my own experiences, that many people in DEI, people who lead resource groups or are involved in the DEI efforts, by the nature of their own experience, are really good at code switching. They're really good at understanding that in order to be able to be perceived correctly and to get their message across in this particular setting, they have to do it this way versus that way. On the other hand, people that belong to a dominant culture, whether in the United States or anywhere else, tend to not even be aware of code switching because they don't code switch. Their way seems to be the way. And so they don't think of this topic at all. So I think that what some of the work that Ernisha and some of the others are doing here is to help expand that lens of understanding on the part of people who may not understand this code switching, to understand that all these different elements are there of communication. But it's still, from what you're saying, you still have to have a certain amount of personal responsibility where you say, you know what, in this particular setting, in order to get this point across the way I want to, this is the phraseology that I need to use, and this is the approach. That's the sense that I'm getting from this conversation with you.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about later how to be effective without having to code switch 100% and not having to become Tom Brady, right? Because to me, that is not a victory. That is a compromise, right?
Agreed. Yep.
So we're definitely going to talk about that. Yeah, so I love where this conversation is going in terms of understanding executive presence. So I feel like as a group, we all have a better sense of executive presence, how it works, why it's important to understand how it's generated and how we can generate it and how it's different, right? Depending on the situation and, the person. Raise your hand or come off of mute if there's any lingering questions, because I want to make sure we understand how executive presence works before we move on to executive presence for underrepresented professionals, because it'd be a disservice to move on if you don't actually feel like you understand what we're talking about for this definitional part, which is universal.
This is Damien here.
Hey,
Looks like
Damien,
my
you're
audio's
back.
working. Great.
Welcome.
Okay, give me a chance to test. Thank you.
Yeah.
See if I can come off on camera. So actually, I'm looking forward to the next part because I think this is something that I was struggling with, which is you mentioned consistency of tone and intention, and people can perceive when you're insincere.
Yeah.
And I guess that's my challenge with this code switching question.
Mm-hmm.
The punchy way that things occur to me are not necessarily going to land in a way that's punchy to others.
That's right.
So that effort to translate, I just kind of find that taxing. And I think sometimes that frustration comes through in the wrong moments.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And let me just be presumptuous to say that that energy that you expend having to deal with that probably makes you not able to perform at your highest and best. Would you agree with that?
I would like to think that's the reason. Yeah.
Well, let's just say it depletes your potential, right?
Yeah, it's taking something. Yeah. It's taking something.
Yeah. Now, imagine someone else who has the same background as you, but for whatever reason doesn't have to code switch, right? They don't have that depletion. Do you think that makes life a little bit easier for them from a competitive standpoint?
Yeah, I should think so. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like you have this weight on your back, like an extra 5 pounds, and you're trying to run 100 meters or whatever the race is. And you have an extra weight that your competitor, through no fault of their own, maybe doesn't have that weight, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to you or to anyone like you who has to carry that weight, it is not, for lack of a better word, a fair race. It is not a fair competition because things are set up that, guess what, Damien, you always get to carry 5 extra pounds.
Yeah. And that can weigh on me sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I love about this conversation is we're going to approach this from the perspective of not some utopia where all of a sudden Joe waves a magic wand and nobody sees color, nobody sees ability, no one sees neurodiversity or gender, right? We're going to come at it from the perspective that this is the system or the world that currently exists today. How do we navigate it, period? Not tomorrow. Like, how does Damien navigate it so he gets better results today? And maybe that 5 pounds starts to feel like 4 pounds, 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 1 pound, and then maybe eventually it goes away. So that's what we're trying to get to today, not tomorrow. Because I don't know about you, but I got a lot of years to work and I'd like this to start now.
Yeah.
I don't want to wait.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to it.
Hey, Joe, as I'm listening to you talking to Damien and talking about this and looking at some of the comments here about how difficult and exhausting code switching is, what Damien is experiencing is not a unique experience. A lot of people who have to go through that exercise experience it. And I love your point that this is what you're talking about today is about what can we start to do right now to maybe lessen that burden at the same
Mhm.
time and build the ability for people to be able to establish themselves more as leaders? And one of the comments that I put in there is that long term, one of the goals of our role as DEI leaders is to gradually reduce the need for that code switching burden by
Yeah.
making organizations more aware of the variety in which talent comes and presents itself. Because right now, organizations are also suffering by not getting the most that they can out of, let's say, Damien or someone else who has to spend so much of their energy doing code switching that they can't focus all that energy on accomplishing the particular goal that's set before them. So we have that immediate need, which you're going to address. And then we have that long-term work that we as DEI professionals are doing to reduce that friction, remove that friction and that weight of the need for all that code switching.
Yeah, I think we need both, and both need to be actively worked on like since yesterday. So agree with that 100%. And thanks, Damien, for sharing that personal perspective. Really appreciate that. All right, so I think we're good on the executive presence. And here's the question of the day, right? But Joe, doesn't executive presence work differently for underrepresented professionals? And if you think it doesn't, you're either lucky or you haven't been paying attention, right? Because anyone that I've ever talked to who's an underrepresented professional has been sort of treated differently, perceived differently to varying degrees when it comes to executive presence on various levels, right? Whether the person thinks their leadership material, whether they react a different way. I mean, one of my mentees is a woman, very, let's say, I admire her quite a bit, even as a mentee, and I knew from the time we hired her onto the team that she was going to go far. And she would typically get feedback from her manager after she moved to a different group about her, sort of management style, because she worked in an organization where she managed pretty much all men, right? So they had an issue not with her capability, because no one would ever have an issue with that. She's like super capable, but the way she talked to them, right? It's like, and she told me this, and I was like, yeah, you see what's going on here, right? It's because you're a woman that they don't like being talked to that way by a woman, versus if you were a man, and I guarantee you've probably seen men talk to them this way. It's just the most natural thing. Yes, sir, I'm on it, right? Versus you, it's not the phraseology you use. It's the fact that it's coming from you and their perception of you that is creating this dynamic, right? So that's kind of the starting point that we're working from in terms of executive presence. And then, and we've touched on this, before with Renee, with Damien, with several others, what I like to call the diversity dilemma, right? How do I resolve the dilemma between fully embracing my unique, most powerful self and becoming more like others to bridge the gap, right? How do you do that? Do you code switch all the time? Because that's tiring, and maybe you're tired and you forget to code switch sometime, and that gets used against you, right? Do you just say, whatever, I'm going to be me all the time, and you are perceived as not a fit and you get passed over, and this is happening, right? But you refuse to compromise or to act like someone who you are not, and realize that as long as you stay in that organization, that your career will be much slower, right? Because they're just not going to accept or appreciate you the way you are. Now, these are real problems that professionals like us are experiencing today, that people you're working for, or maybe people you manage are experiencing, maybe people you report to are experiencing this as well. Because when you're underrepresented, your way of doing things, perceiving things, processing things is not going to be the default, right? It's going to be other, right? So that's the point that we're starting for. How do we square that, right? Without just becoming something we are not, because one, frankly, for me, it's not very motivating to pretend to be someone else. Two, it's tiring, right? As Damien pointed out. And three, it doesn't enable me to do my best work. If I have to imagine what people want me to say rather than coming up with the creative ideas that come organically from who I am and my identity and my uniqueness, my ideas are not going to be as good. I'm not going to be as engaged. I'm not going to be productive. And you know who that hurts besides me? The organization, right? The organization is not getting the best version of me. Now, they may not appreciate that, right? But from a practical returns perspective, if I have the next great idea and I never get it out because of this diversity dilemma, the organization, unbeknownst to them, is the one who's suffering. Their productivity is going down, their creativity, their innovation is going down. So all these people that you're recruiting for diversity of ideas, all these people that you're recruiting for innovation, you're not going to get the benefit, right? Because if they have to pretend to be someone else to succeed, guess what? Some of them are, and the people who aren't maybe aren't going to have great results. So you're going to end up with a real kind of disaster where you're just feeding the pipeline, right? Maybe you are able to find, lots of great candidates. I hope you do, but you're not getting the results. And then executives wonder, well, why? We hired a bunch of people who are different than the people we hired before. Why are they not producing, or why are we not getting better results? Why is there still turnover? Why are they leaving? And sort of the answer to that, which I think all of us understand intuitively, is because they're not comfortable where they are being themselves, and they don't feel like they can succeed the same way their peers can succeed through no fault of their own. And, not necessarily any fault through their peers who are succeeding either, right? Unless they're actively sabotaging. I'm just going to pause for a second. Any comments or questions on that? I imagine people may have experienced that in their own careers. If not, I'll proceed to a little bit more tactics.
Hi, yes, this is Ernisha. I mean, I can definitely say earlier in my career, I experienced that. I've done a lot of personal work because I recognize that in this environment, a lot of the challenges that I was facing or feeling, the things I'm feeling, were related to traumas that happened in other environments like school, places that sort of prepared me for the landscape of corporate America and being the only in a room. But I feel like executive presence, it's not only how you show up in a room, it starts with feeling like you belong there in the first place.
Yes.
And I think that's what I've been able to help develop over the last couple of years in particular, because for as much as I'd like to think in 2022, I shouldn't still be the only one in the room, I am still the only one in the room, and you bear the burden of representing. You win or you fail for your entire race or gender, or however you identify when you are underrepresented. And so for me, I think earlier in my career, I wasn't showing up in the best way because I didn't believe I belonged in the room. Now I believe I belong there. It really helps me show up in my most authentic way without feeling the need to code switch or dial down who I am to make other people.
So Arnisha, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm picturing you earlier in your career, right? And there's a table, right, with everyone who's sort of invited to be part of the club. And, you're kind of circling around the table and there's no chair for you, right? No one's, kind of inviting you to sit, and you're just kind of waiting, and you're like, oh, I'm not sure I belong here. Where now, even if there is no space, Arnisha picks up a chair, says, excuse me, takes her seat at the table. I'm here. I belong at the table, right? So that's kind of a difference that definitely comes with that confidence, and is great for executive presence. And, to Joe's point, like that psychic wounds from earlier experience, sometimes things need to happen for us to get to that point, therapy, mental health, no shame in seeking health. I've had imposter syndrome for many years. Luckily was able to get help through my organization to get a therapist to help me with that. There is, no shame in improving yourself by addressing those things so you can show up as your best, fullest self. So thank you so much for being vulnerable and sharing that, Ernisha. All right, great. So how do I win over the crowd, right? What do you do? Let's make this very, very tactical. You have a manager, and no matter what you do, you know, or you feel that they will never fully support you. They are just not going to see you as a manager. And this is not theoretical. I've had friends who've left companies because they have done everything their manager asked, waited on every promise to be delivered, always need more budget. This is not the time. It's always one excuse. You need this degree, you need this certification, you need this experience. Everything is always a hurdle. You know, the shell game, right? Where there's like a red ball under the shell. And then, if you locate where the red ball is, you get $20, right? Like it's like a street hustle game, 3-card money, it's also called. Well, anyone who knows that game is, guess what? You can never win. The game is rigged. The ball is never underneath the shell. It's in the person's palm, right? And then you start to wonder, wait a second, I saw someone win a whole bunch of times. And that's why I decided to play. And that's when I lost my $20. How did that person win? You know why? Because that person is a Confederate. They are part of the team. They are in on it. They're part of the club. And guess what? They get to win. You play, thank you for playing. You're gonna lose every time. Why? Fundamentally, because you're not considered part of the team. You're not on the team. If you were on the team, you would win and you would split the proceeds and you wouldn't have a problem, right? So that's kind of an analogy for how it can often feel like it's working with a manager who just doesn't feel like you're gonna be leadership material, right? We're talking about executive presence here, getting promoted, getting projects, getting assignments that help your career. And then also we're going to expand it in just a moment as well to talk about, well, what about a panel, right? What if your boss supports you, but you got to get 4 or 5 other bosses to approve you for the big promotion because your boss doesn't have the juice or it's not structured governance-wise that they get to decide, right? They're not the CEO, right? A panel of other judges who have their favorite candidates that they're supporting. Some of them have to say, you know what, guess what? You're the best candidate. I'm going to pick you. How do we do that? All right, so let's look at it this way, the river crossing challenge. So I'm going to ask, let's see, Fang. Fang, if you could come off of mute, I'm going to ask you in just a second. Let's say, Fang, you are at A and your manager is at B. So in that whitewater rapids in between is this gap of perception. They just aren't going to come over to your side and cross over to A to believe that you are going to make it, right? So what would you do? What could help get your manager over to your side? What would be helpful here? Because right now they'd have to jump into the water. What would be helpful? Bang, are you there? All right, let me ask.
Bang, you're unmuted on my end. Maybe on your end, your phone or your device is muted.
Okay, let me ask. Let's ask Lisa. Lisa, are you there? Can you come off of mute if you're able to?
Yep.
Thanks, Lisa. So what would be helpful to get B over to A?
Just, I guess, support with other people in the organization.
Let's look at it from a very physical, literal perspective, right? There's a raging river and one's on one side, one's on the other. What would help B get over to A?
A bridge.
Yeah, absolutely. A bridge, right? You expect B to just jump into the water because you want them to. You would have to build a bridge over, which is what I think you were saying from that perspective. Now, would A be more or less likely to come over to your side if you crossed over to their side first?
If you went to their side first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is?
it's less effort on. I mean, if you come to them first, they're more inclined like to do like now you're over there and they're gonna go back with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you've got their attention. I mean, in not in the bridge standpoint, but right, you've got their attention.
Yeah, 100%, Lisa. So imagine Lisa standing there on A. There's a bridge, right? She somehow knocks a bridge down and waves over B and says, "Boss, come over. It's safe. Trust me. Come over." Right? Think about that versus Lisa walks over, right? Tests the bridge, comes over to B and her boss and looks around and says, "Oh, okay. I see why you may not want to come over. Let's talk about that. Let's resolve that. I can kind of see more from your perspective. Why don't we talk about it a little bit? Come over to where I was in A," right? It's much more likely to happen when we see things from others' perspective first. Now, it's not about agreeing, but it's about understanding that their perspective may be fundamentally different than yours. They may have a bias for elite schools. They may have a bias for experience. They may not think women should be in certain jobs, or they may think men should not be in certain jobs, right? If you don't understand where that's coming from, you have much less chance of addressing it and getting them to understand. So I'll show a different scenario where, let's say there's this panel, right? And they all have to decide on who comes over. Again, a bridge would help. And what would also help is if one of the people on the panel, let's say it's your boss this time, crosses over first and tells everyone else, their peers, like, "Look, Lisa is amazing. I know normally we don't have a XYZ fill in the gap in this role. You should still listen to what Lisa has to say, because this is really going to make a difference for the company." Now, no guarantee that BD and E are going to agree. However, think about the impact of having someone sponsor you, of having an advocate versus everyone is just on the other side and you're like, "Listen to me, listens to me," right? And so they did an interesting study where there's a tipping point of about 25%, where if there's some minority viewpoint versus a majority viewpoint, when 25% of people start to assume the minority viewpoint, it starts to tip. And then people who are kind of like in the middle and were undecided actually start to move over, and the minority viewpoint becomes the majority viewpoint. So the shorthand I like to use is 1 out of 4, right? If you go into any meeting, let's say there's 4 people, is at least one person there on your side? You don't need 100%, right? But is at least one person there understanding you, know you, support you? Because if not, I would say probably better to figure out how to get someone like that in the meeting, or get someone in that meeting on your side before you show up. Because otherwise you're going to have a really tough perception gap ahead of you. And the 3 words I like to use is stack the deck, right? We already have a lot of things against us, right? Why not stack the deck by making sure your sponsor is in the room? Because frankly, other people are being sponsored just by virtue of who they are, right? Because they're part of the same group or team. The perception already is leaning towards acceptance, right? So stack the deck. So we talked a little bit earlier about uncertainty, and I'm going to try to go through this a little bit quickly just to leave time for Q&A. How do you keep going despite uncertainty, setbacks, and competing demands, right? Because this can certainly be trying, and it can be difficult. And we heard about sort of the psychic thing that we may need to go through, and the work that we need to do. We heard about sort of the challenges and the draining. I drew some inspiration from a quote that I read or heard from Jonathan Rowson, who's a Scottish chess grandmaster. And he said, when it comes to ambition, it's crucial to distinguish between wanting something and choosing it, right? Because if you decide you want to be world champion, you will inevitably fail to put in the hard work, right? It's because you want it. Like, wouldn't it be nice to be world champion? But the distinction he makes is between motivation and volition. However, if you choose to become world champion, then you will reveal your choice through your behavior and determination. Every action says, this is who I am, right? So if you see that people who are where you want to be or who you choose to be, right, whatever that is, doesn't have to be CEO, it could be anything, right? You are going to take those steps that you understand are necessary to get there, right? If you need sponsors, thanks for that, Joe, you're going to get sponsors because you see that no one who achieves what you are meant to be gets there without sponsors. So that's not negotiable anymore. It's no longer, oh, it's really hard, I don't have time when no, you were doing it. If you have to get up early, if you have to stay late, if you have to do whatever to get that sponsor and learn how to do it, maybe take a course and pay out of your own pocket to learn how to get sponsors, you're going to do it. You don't have a choice because you've chosen, this is who I am. If you need help psychologically, right, with your mental health, you're going to overcome any sort of cultural, maybe sort of shame or reticence to do that. And you're going to get it because you're going to realize, like, look, this is a very psychologically taxing position. People who do what I am meant to be, they need to be at the top of their mental game. So I am going to get this help and I'm going to be at the top of my mental game. So to me, this is a really powerful way to think about it, to deal with it and saying, look, if you choose that this is what you want, now everything you see, everything you do, and you'll start to see that like things that you never perceived before will all of a sudden become very clear. And conversations before which you wouldn't have even seen the help, they will become crystallized because you're like, oh, because I've chosen that this is who I am. Not, it'd be nice to have, because we would all like certain things. But it's like a New Year's resolution. How many of those actually get followed through? So last part before we go to Q&A, how do I get rewarded instead of punished for my authenticity, right? I mean, this could be a presentation in and of itself, right? This is like a headline kind of thing for underrepresented professionals, right? Because you go and you try to be yourself, and then sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I like to call this the code of authenticity. So I'm going to run through a quick example, and then we'll head to Q&A as to how this works. So one of my favorite dishes that my wife makes is sundubu. It's this spicy, soft tofu stew. It's Korean. It's delicious. It's spicy. And I'll tell you, maybe if you haven't had it before, you're not a big fan of Asian food, you may not appreciate the smell from the pantry when I'm heating it up in the microwave. Let's just call a spade, right? Now, let's imagine two scenarios. You are new. You just came back from a trip to Korea. You went there for a wedding, or your friends over there invited you over and you discovered sundubu. It's amazing. You go to a local restaurant, you pick some up, you have some for dinner with your family. Everyone loves it. You bring it in for lunch. You want to heat it up in the pantry, right? Let's assume you're at work at this point. I know I'm not in a pantry much anymore. And this is your first sort of day at work. Nobody knows you, right? And you heat this up, and then, understandably, a lot of people are like, what is that smell? And they walk over and they see you, new person, never seen you before. And they're like, what is going on here? How do you think their perception of you would be? Let me ask Antoine. I don't think I've heard from you before. If you're able to come off of mute, Antoine. What do you think people's perception of you would be in that moment? You're heating up this food and these people don't like the smell. How do you think they would react to you, Antoine?
And I apologize, Joe. You haven't heard from me because I actually just joined the session.
Oh, no worries. You don't have to apologize to me. Thank you for joining.
I have a conflict throughout the day, so I'll be ducking in and out.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, to your question, probably some type of unconscious bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
People will probably have some perception or some unconscious biased thoughts about me without really even truly knowing me or knowing anything about me. So that's my initial assessment.
100%. So let me give you a follow-up question, easy one. So let's say, Antoine, it's not your first day at work. You are a superstar in the organization, right? I'm assuming you are, right? I'm just going to make that positive assumption. You are a high flyer, and guess what? You're a nice guy. You help others. You contribute to charity. You are like on track to become the next CEO of Dollar General, right? Let's just assume that. Now, you're heating up the same food. People still don't like the smell. They walk into the pantry. It's Antoine. What is their reaction now?
That's right. Completely different, right? They're going to give me a pass just because they like me, because I'm well respected. So they're going to give me a pass and they're going to be fine with it. They're probably not going to even comment on it.
Isn't that funny? Maybe they'll even ask if someone's adventurous to try it.
Right. Yeah. You're
Because
right.
it's Antoine.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So the key here, and what I really love to point out, because this has been sort of huge for me from a acceptance perspective, is it's the connection you have with them. Right. In scenario A, no one knew you from a hole in the wall. So how dare you? Right. Versus
Right.
now it's Antoine, future CEO, star, person who drove me to the hospital when no one in my family could, or picked me up from the airport when my car got canceled. It's Antoine. Right? That connection is what makes your authenticity fully powerful and realized. Now this dish becomes interesting, right? It becomes exotic. Wow, amazing. He's so adventurous versus how dare you bring that into our house and heat that up. The difference is now it's our house and it includes Antoine, right? Because Antoine's like leading the house almost, right? So the way I like to put this very simply is, without connection, your authenticity is a liability. People use things that are different about you to make you more other, to dislike you, to confirm their bias against you. With connection, your authenticity becomes an asset. Isn't that interesting? Oh, wow. Never opening my mind, never saw it that way, right? So I think the mistake that a lot of us make is, I can just be whoever I want, regardless of whether people like me or not, or know who I am or connected. It doesn't work that way for anyone, right? If people don't feel a connection to you, then your authenticity becomes other and it's a liability. Now, of course, life is not fair. For some people, it's easy because they're already part of the group, right? So they don't need to develop as much of a connection. Some of us are already in a default position, like one leg is in the other department, right? So it's always going to take more for us to connect. Not that you can't, but the default is not there for you. So the default is like halfway connected or not connected. So to understand that and to understand, like, as I make this stronger connection, I'm going to be able to bring more of my authenticity to bear, and it's going to be more powerful, I think is a much more practical way to think about authenticity versus let me just be who I am and everyone's going to love me. It doesn't work. So I'm going to leave some time for questions. Sorry, I thought I had until 45, but the 3 C's of the diversity dilemma: build your club, right? Make that bridge 25%, 1 out of 4. Make your choice, right? It's volition, not motivation, right? Choose who you're meant to be. And third, crack the code of authenticity. Connect with people, and your authenticity will become an asset and not a liability. So I'm going to open it up for any questions. And thank you so much for everyone's participation and questions and disclosures. It's been wonderful.
Joe, before they start, I just wanted to let you know that was a fantastic presentation. I like the way you sum things up in the end. And I actually listed a couple of tips that I just pulled out, which I think are parallel to what you were talking about. Tip number 1 for me was secure sponsors who are insiders to support you. Tip number 2 is stack that deck in your favor. Pre-sell some of the people who are going to be judging your potential before they get into that group meeting, so you have some supporters in there. And based on the rule that you shared with everyone, if it's 4 people, at least 1. If it's 8 people, at least 2. The third thing was find coaches and other external supporters to help you to prepare mentally to succeed. And then the final one, as you establish your connection with people, you can reveal more of your authenticity, because then it becomes less of a liability and more of a superpower. And then I just added a note that this changes as our organizations become more inclusive and more aware of these different things. But to your point, to succeed right now, where we are right now, these are some really solid things that people could start doing that'll get them there. So folks, questions, ideas, what you've got, what you want to ask. But first, let me pause the recording system.